We're here today to do the asbestos awareness seminar that AHERA requires for maintenance and custodial people that are involved in doing work in schools where they are not actually performing asbestos abatement work themselves. My name is Dan Cooper. I'm with Microanalytics, and I'll be giving the presentation today, and it'll be accompanied with a PowerPoint presentation so you guys will be able to kind of follow along and see what you see. The main things that we're going to talk about, first of all, we're going to discuss what asbestos is. We're going to talk some about what the health effects of asbestos are and how your body has natural mechanisms to try to prevent disease, including asbestos. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the various asbestos rules and regulations, what standards apply. We're going to talk some again about where asbestos is found, both in general and then give you some specific guidelines to where you might be able to find out where asbestos actually is located in your facility in school. Then we're going to discuss how to recognize damaged ACBM, because that is where we find that there is the highest potential risk for exposure to individuals, and so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to recognize a damaged asbestos material. We'll talk some finally about what are the proper housekeeping activities, what are the things that we want to do in order to make sure that we don't put ourselves at risk and create dangerous situations related to asbestos while we're going through our normal day-to-day activities. So let's begin with what asbestos is. Asbestos is a mineral fiber. It's found most frequently in mines. It's very similar to talcum powder or coal. It's usually mined, and it comes out of the mine as rock, and then it's typically processed in a processing facility where it actually takes this rock or this mineral and turns it into a usable building material. One of the most significant things about asbestos that creates the opportunity for it to cause diseases is that it is a crystalline structure. In other words, the building blocks for asbestos are little bitty pieces of materials that build on top of each other and on top of each other, so that it can be continuously broken down into small little pieces of itself that look exactly like itself, and ultimately these pieces can get small enough to where they can actually be inhaled through your nose and into your lungs. This is a little bit different than fiberglass. When you're dealing with fiberglass, fiberglass has a finite diameter that it cannot get smaller than, just because of the way it's extruded and manufactured. So the asbestos creates a much more significant potential health risk than fiberglass would be. Asbestos is mostly dangerous when it gets into very small pieces, because we need to get the pieces down to chunks that are small enough for us to breathe. It's very similar, like I said earlier, like coal or talcum powder. In fact, it's found very frequently in conjunction with talcum powder, and it's these fine small particles that ultimately can do the damage in your lungs. So what are the different kinds of asbestos? There is a number of different types of asbestos. There's probably 8 or 9 different kinds of asbestos that actually exist in the universe or in the world, and the ones that we are most concerned about from the standpoint of adverse health effects, and the ones that are regulated, are actually the materials that are found in fibrous forms when they occur in nature. Fibrous means basically it's something that's longer than it is wide. If you think of maybe a needle would be an example of something that looks like a fiber. It's 3, 4, 5, 100 times longer than it is wide. They're usually really long and really thin. The most common type of asbestos that's found in the United States is a fibrous form of asbestos that's known as chrysotile. Chrysotile is usually a real white, fluffy type material. It's used a lot in insulating materials. It's found in a lot of other types of building materials as well, such as ceiling tiles, floor tiles, mastics. We'll get into some of those specific uses a little bit later. But the most common type, like I said, is chrysotile. It's about 90% of the total asbestos that's used in the building industry in the United States is comprised of this chrysotile asbestos. If there is any good news associated with asbestos, this is probably it. There are a number of countries that don't even regulate chrysotile. A lot of the European countries, they don't believe that this type of material is as dangerous of an asbestos-formed material as some of the others, and as such they don't normally regulate it. If you think of the angel hair that you see sometimes on top of mangers, if you're a Christian and you put a manger up at Christmas time, this angel hair, this fluffy stuff that looks a little bit like cotton, is typically the type of formulation of asbestos that you find is chrysotile. I guess the second most common type of asbestos that you find in the United States is an asbestos that is called amosite. Amosite is also identified by a lot of people as brown asbestos. It's commonly called brown asbestos, and it's a much more rigid type of asbestos. We talked a little bit earlier about there being a consideration of a fiber being something that looks like a needle. Well, if you look at asbestos fibers for amosite underneath the microscope, they actually do look like little bitty needles. They typically are not susceptible to water wetting them, as chrysotile more frequently has an affinity for water, as the other forms of asbestos, including amosite, tends to fend the water off because of its chemical configuration. I guess the third and least common type of asbestos that you find used, at least in the United States, is a fibrous form of asbestos that's known as chrysotile. Chrysotile, is known as blue asbestos because it actually is dark blue in color. It's very similar in terms of its chemical structure and physical appearance to amosite, in that it's very rigid, it's very needle-like, it isn't amphibole, and it doesn't like to be wetted as well as amosite. So these are the main types of asbestos that we find most commonly in the United States. There's chrysotile, where about 90% of the materials that have asbestos in them contain this chrysotile. Amosite is the next most common. It's a very rigid type of asbestos, and that comprises a little bit more than 5% of the uses of asbestos in the United States. And then you have chrysotile, which maybe that's 1–2%, and all of the other forms of asbestos compiled add up to make the other balance between that 98% and 100%. So what do they do with this material? What's the value of asbestos? It's been used for thousands of years as a material because of its tensile strength, its rigidity, its durability. But why did they use it in the building materials that we're finding in the United States? Well, one of the most common uses of it is it's a very good insulator. It doesn't conduct heat, and it doesn't conduct electricity. So from the standpoint of it not conducting heat, it's used a lot of time on insulations that you'll find on pipes, insulations that you might find on boilers or hot water heaters. You might find it as insulation on electrical wiring. A lot of the old wiring that was used in theaters, the outer lining of the electrical wiring had chrysotile asbestos as the external jacket, just because it didn't conduct heat and it didn't conduct electricity. Another property, like I said, is it's very heat resistant. So another common application for asbestos, it can be found a lot of times in applied fireproofing, a lot of times in buildings where you have a metal or a steel deck. The fire code of the time that the building was constructed in the middle to late 70s, the fire code called for a fireproof material to be actually sprayed upon the beams, and the reason that this was applied was to prevent the spread of heat and fire if a portion of the building would catch on fire. So that a lot of the mixtures that were used for this fireproofing at that time, one of its components was asbestos. It's typically chrysotile or andesite asbestos. You'll also find asbestos in a number of the ceiling tiles. A lot of buildings, including schools and churches, have either lay-in ceiling tiles that are installed from a suspended grid, or ceiling tiles that are either attached to each other in a process that's called spline, or else glued to the ceiling above. Some of these actual ceiling tiles that are in fire-rated areas have been identified as asbestos containing. It's a very durable material as well. In addition to its properties with respect to heat transfer, it's very, very durable and it lasts a really long time. So it was put into some building materials in order to give them added strength and rigidity. Examples of this would be floor tile. A lot of the early on floor tiles were a mixture of asphalt and asbestos. The asbestos was put in there sort of as a binder to hold the actual materials together, and it was also put there to prevent the material, the floor tiles themselves, from deteriorating over time. That's another use for asbestos in the ceiling tiles. We talked about it in fire-rated ceiling tiles because of its ability to prevent the spread of heat. Well, because of its tensile strength and its ability to bind, it also can be found in a number of different lay-in ceiling tiles and attached ceiling tiles, simply from the standpoint of holding the rest of the material together. Another place where you'll find it, which I really am not certain why it's in these materials, but it's very, very common for it to be found in these materials, are in certain glues and mastics. It's very, very common to find asbestos as a substantial component of the glue that is applied to a surface before you put a floor tile down. Typically, there are 2 or 3 different colors of this mastic, and you can't always tell by the color of the glue, but just because of the colors versus construction dates, typically you'll find black tars and mastics that actually contain anywhere from 5 to 20% chrysotile asbestos. Some of the acoustic ceilings that you find in schools and other buildings are actually 12-inch tiles that have been glued to a surface like we talked about earlier. Well, not only can you find asbestos in the tiles themselves, but also in the glue that is used to adhere the tile to the surface above. So that normally on a 12-inch ceiling tile, you'll see maybe 4 glue dots, is what we call them, that are maybe 2 inches, 3 inches in diameter, usually 1 on each corner of the actual ceiling tile. And these glue dots have a tendency in the earlier types of glue that was used for adhering the ceiling tiles to also contain chrysotile asbestos. Let's talk about some fairly common terms that we can find when we're in conversations about asbestos. And some of these materials are materials that I'm sure you will have seen in some of your facilities, but not really understood the term. The first one that I'd like to talk about is a material that's called air-cell. Air-cell is a name that's given to a specific type of asbestos insulation that usually is found on cold water lines or warm water lines where you're not dealing with high temperature and pressure. And the reason that this is a significant type of asbestos containing material is because it doesn't look like asbestos at all. If you look at a cross section of a cardboard box where you see the pieces of cardboard going in and out of the structure of the material, air-cell insulation looks very similar to that. However, it's a combination of cellulose, paper, and asbestos that are woven together, and the term air-cell comes from the terminology of the actual insulating properties of the material is from the air cells or the spaces that are in the material. So it looks very much like a corrugated box, and early on a lot of people misidentified this as a non-asbestos material simply based upon its physical appearance. But when you have this type of material and it's associated with a heating system or a water system, virtually 100% of the time upon analysis you will discover that that actual air cell does contain asbestos. There's another term that's used a lot that's called mag. Mag is a white material. It does look a lot like talcum powder, but it's usually very white. It tends to be very fluffy. On pipe insulation and on pipe elbows, it usually appears pretty hard, But when you break it off, there are very thin-like fibers or hair-like projections that run through it. The actual powder, the dust, is an inert material. It's usually a calcium carbonate or a hydroxide form. And the actual asbestos that's in mag is actually these hair-like projections, or this fibrous web of material that actually holds it together. So if you see that, there is a good indication that you could have asbestos there. Not all material that looks like mag is asbestos, but a good percentage of the materials are, if in fact they are constructed at an earlier date. I have two more terms that I want to talk about briefly. The first one is called spray-on. You'll hear people talk about spray-on, where this is the acoustic material that we talked about earlier, where you may find it on structured steel, where it's actually spray applied, or sometimes it's applied to a ceiling or a decorative around the sides of a wall or something like that. Well, it's actually sprayed or troweled on. A lot of times this material contains asbestos as well. The final term I want to talk about is a term that is called blue mud. A lot of times when you look at piping systems and their insulation, the actual main runs, the 3-foot sections of insulation that's on the pipe might be fiberglass, but you also look at the elbows, and a lot of times the elbows have a tendency to be a little bit grayer or almost blue, and when you cut into them, you'll see the same thing as you see with the mag. You'll see a powdery, dusty material, but there also are a number of fibers that run through this in a matrix that holds it together. And typically this matrix of fibrous materials is a form of asbestos, usually chrysotile, but it also can be amosite. But when you have a fitting that is of this color, this bluish gray color, it almost always is known to contain asbestos. Can't tell about any of these materials without having them tested, but as a general rule, when you're walking through and looking in areas, if you have this information in the back of your hand, in the back of your mind, you'll be less likely to do something inadvertent and causing a problem where a problem didn't exist. Let's change gears for just a minute now and talk a little bit about definitions. In dealing with all of this science of asbestos, the rules, the terminologies, one of the things that makes a substantial difference in the way that you look at some of these things is understanding the definitions. So I've got a couple of definitions that I want to talk about here. Some of the terms that I've already used, which probably should have talked about them a little bit earlier, but at least we'll get them in front of you so that you'll have an understanding of a little bit about what we're talking about from this point forward. You hear a lot of times the term ACM. That is a term that means an asbestos-containing material. You'll find that in most of the regulations that we're going to discuss a little bit further along. And what an asbestos-containing material by definition is a material that contains more than 1% by weight of asbestos. So you can have an asbestos-containing material with a material that's 1.5%. You can have a small amount of asbestos in a material. If it's less than 1%, then it actually is not considered by definition an asbestos-containing material. Sort of along the same lines, but consistent with the rule that governs asbestos in schools, is a term that is called ACBM. ACBM stands for asbestos-containing building materials. ACBM is a subset of all the ACMs that there are. We'll find that when we're talking about AHERA and the asbestos in school rules, that the only thing that that rule addresses are certain types of asbestos materials that are found inside the school. So regulated materials under AHERA are known as ACBM, or asbestos-containing building materials. There's another term that you need to understand. It's called PACM, or presumed asbestos-containing materials. You'll find as we walk through the regulations that the rules don't necessarily require that you identify all of the materials that are in your building or your facility, but they require you to presume that a material is asbestos if you don't actually sample it to identify. And if you presume that a material is asbestos, then you have to handle it, manage it in a way as if it were asbestos. But PACM means presumed asbestos-containing material. One of the most important terms that that is involved in dealing with asbestos and its potential to have adverse health effects on people is a term that is called friable. And I'd like for you to think about that term and try to burn that into the back of your mind if you could, because whether or not an asbestos material is friable is very important from a number of different ways, including what the potential health effects of its presence in an area are, whether it's a regulated material, what it is that you need to do with it. The EPA has a definition of friable which says material that is able to be pulverized to a powder using normal hand pressure. However, when different regulatory agencies actually use that term friable from a regulatory perspective, I think a more applicable definition is a material that has the potential to become airborne and or release fibers into the air. A lot of materials that you couldn't normally crumble into powder with hand pressure can be considered friable by a number of regulatory agencies. For example, floor tiles, asphalt floor tiles, asbestos mastics that are solid glues, roofing felts and materials that you would have a really hard time because either of the physical strength of the material or the bound and interwoven properties of the glue releasing asbestos into a powder, but at the same time, if it has its potential to release fibers into the air during the handling of it, a lot of regulatory agencies will consider it a friable material. With this information in mind, I'd like to talk our way through a little bit about the potential adverse health effects associated with exposure to asbestos. And before we do that, I think I'd like to talk a little bit about how it comes together, what it is about asbestos that makes it a dangerous material. And in order to do that, let's go back to the original discussions that we had about where asbestos comes from and what it's like. First of all, we said it is a mineral fiber that is a crystal. That means that it can break down into little bitty pieces that are mirror images or images of the big piece. Understand that asbestos is only a potential health hazard when the fibers are airborne. In other words, we talked earlier about asbestos coming out of a mine as a rock. Well, if you have a big rock of asbestos and you're sitting in the room that you're in and nobody ever does anything to that rock, then you're not going to have any problems with the material from the rock becoming airborne and creating a potential problem for the people that are in the room. That's not so. Think about chlorine gas. If you take liquid chlorine and you stick it in a container and you put it into a room, it would evaporate, evolve, the fumes would fill the room, and the people that are sitting in this room would basically pass out from exposure to chlorine. Well, asbestos is not that way. In order for there to be a hazard associated with asbestos, something has to be physically done to the material to release fibers and to get them into the air so that people that are occupying the space can breathe them. Goes back to the term friable. If you don't have a friable material, you don't have the risk for people to be exposed to asbestos. So how does this start? How does the disease start? Usually diseases that are associated with asbestos exposure are associated with the respiratory tract and lungs. And it starts by an individual inhaling these very small fibers, and the fibers getting past your body's immune system to a place where they can cause damage actually inside your body, like I said, normally in your respiratory tract or lungs. Although there are instances where asbestos-related diseases have shown up other places in people's bodies, these are very, very rare. One of the things that we'll discuss as we go through these diseases is a term that's called a latency period. One of the reasons that asbestos has the potential to be such a dangerous material with respect to disease is that it isn't like a lot of diseases where if you're exposed to pathogenic bacteria, 2 days later you come down with a bacterial disease, or if somebody sneezes at you that has the flu, then 2 or 3 days you come down with the flu. Well, there is typically an extended latency period associated with someone who is exposed to asbestos and the time that the person manifests the disease. This period of time between those two events is called the latency period, and we'll see as we go through that this is anywhere from 5 to 40 years. Now, your body has a natural immune system. It has the ability to fight off foreign bodies that come into it, bugs, different types of things, dusts, various types of particles and microorganisms that want to invade your body. Your body has 3 major systems that are able to ward off a lot of these. And it starts with your nose and your sinus cavities. Your body, if you're an adult, has hair inside your nose, and you've got a cavity at the back of your nose, and these two things serve a very useful purpose in life. They are the primary filtration devices for your respiratory tract. Big pieces of dirt get caught into your nose hairs, and there is mucus within your sinus cavities that sort of act like fly paper to collect various particles and residues that are inside the air. So that's actually a #1 way of taking out the big pieces, if you will, while somebody is involved in an environment where there may be dust, fibers, or other types of particles. Then the second method of defense that your body has is a system of cilia and mucous membranes that run along the back of your throat. You actually have cells that create mucus on the back of your throat going into your air passages, and they're very, very small hair-like projections that come out of these cells, and these are called cilia. If you think about seaweed at the bottom of the ocean, when a boat goes across and you see the seaweed blowing in one direction then another when the waves come back, that's kind of like what happens to the cilia in your throat. During the evening, the smaller particles, as the day goes on, the smaller particles that aren't trapped by your nose hairs or your sinus cavities actually get trapped within this web of cilia and mucus during the day, and then when your body is at rest in the evening, there is a trigger mechanism that kind of has these cilia all moving in a general direction towards your nose, towards your nasal passages, and so it passes out during your sleep process a lot of this material that's accumulated. That's the reason a lot of times when the first thing you have to do when you wake up in the morning is blow your nose, is because this process isn't working. Then you have a process that is usually part of the body's antibiotic system where you have white blood cells. Everybody has white blood cells in their that flow through their bloodstream, and these white blood cells or macrophages are organisms inside your body that try to fight off disease. When something gets into your body that isn't supposed to be there, your body's systems know to send warriors, or these white blood cells, to try to gather them up and haul them out. You get bacteria in your body, the body creates a lot of white blood cells. The white blood cells go and they wrap themselves all the way around these bacteria, and it's called engulfing. They actually wrap them up, grab them, the blood system takes them through your kidneys, and then you pass them out through your urinary tract, and that's the way that your body wards off disease a lot of times. And your body tries to do this to asbestos fibers and other types of residues, but it's not able to work that way all of the time. If you think about what we said earlier about asbestos particles being needle-like, they really are needle-like, they really are rigid, and one of the properties that we discussed is their ability to be long-term standing and chemically resistant. So your white blood cells really aren't effective in their ability to move these asbestos fibers out of your body. Now let's talk about what types of diseases there are that a person can contract with exposure to asbestos. The first type of disease that I want to discuss is a disease that's called asbestosis. Asbestosis is typically considered a disease that is a result of a relatively long-term exposure to elevated levels of asbestos fibers, commonly associated with people that work in asbestos mines, people that work in the insulating industry, people that work in the automotive industry back when there was asbestos material in brake lines. But basically what happens is you get an accumulator of asbestos fibers into the lungs, the air sacs in your lungs, and you're not able to inhale air anymore. When the sacs fill up with the dust or the asbestos fibers, then they create scarring. These air sacs or alveoli are no longer able to do their job, and the longer you're exposed to asbestos and the more asbestos you're exposed to, the more of these air sacs that get clogged up, and ultimately it creates a problem with the oxygen transfer system. When the blood goes to your lungs to get oxygen, there's a lot fewer places for it to get the oxygen to give off the carbon dioxide than in a normal person, simply because so many of these air sacs are full of asbestos or other types of dust. The latency period, we discussed the latency period from in an earlier conversation as being the period of time from the initial exposure to something until the time that a disease is manifested. Well, normally with asbestosis, this latency period is anywhere from 10 to 15 years. So it normally takes 10 or so years from the time that you have this initial exposure until the time that you actually are seen to have this asbestosis disease. Another type of disease that's associated with exposure to asbestos is lung cancer. Lung cancer is a tumor. It's created by a tumor that grows in your lungs, where the source of the tumor, the primary source of the tumor, actually is an asbestos fiber or asbestos fiber bundles, to where your body starts to create this system to try to move the asbestos out of your lungs, and it isn't successful in being able to do that. So over time, this tumor forms. If you think about your lungs as a sponge, which is very similar to a sponge, and you think about an asbestos fiber as a needle, it's very hard. You can imagine how complicated or difficult it would be to move a needle out of a sponge, even with all of the white blood cells that your body could possibly amass. So over time, this can create a tumor at the site where the asbestos fiber is, and over the course of time, this tumor can become malignant. And if it does become malignant, then it is a lung cancer tumor that was formed as a result of exposure to asbestos fibers. Normally, the latency period for this is anywhere from 25 to 35 years. So if you're going to have lung cancer from an exposure to asbestos, it's not going to typically manifest itself for anywhere from 20 to 25 years after the exposure occurred. That's one of the reasons that the federal government has promulgated these rules specifically geared towards children, because children that are exposed to asbestos have a much longer anticipated life cycle, and from that standpoint, they're most likely candidates to have these diseases and be able to make it through these latency periods. The final disease that I'm going to talk about is a disease called mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a specific type of cancer that's associated with the lining of the lungs that is caused only by asbestos exposure. You have a very thin layer around the exterior of your lungs that is a lot like saran wrap, and when an asbestos fiber migrates its way through and gets into this lining, which is called the mesoderm or the mesothelial lining, it can also cause a tumor very similar to what we were discussing with the lung cancer, but it is in a spot where there is no way to operate on it at all. There is no other there is no other item in nature that causes mesothelioma with the exception of asbestos, so it's confirmed that it can cause this type of cancer. The one thing about mesothelioma is that in 99% of the cases for people who contract the disease, it's fatal. There aren't a lot of people that get it, but the people that get it, there isn't a cure for it. The latency period for mesothelioma is usually 30 to 40 years. It's a little bit longer than lung cancer, maybe more, maybe less, but it normally takes a very extended period of time for this exposure. So these are the three major diseases that we are going to discuss that are caused by exposure to asbestos. That would be asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma. And although the opportunity or potential for exposure are minimal, there nonetheless is an opportunity for this to occur, and that's why we exercise caution in trying to put regulations together to keep people from being exposed to these materials. Another item somewhat related to health effects, but most significantly related to a combination of adverse effects on you that EPA suggests strenuously that we discuss in these classes is the relationship between smoking and asbestos. There's a term that we use called a synergistic effect, where the effect of two things that are bad for you that you are involved with at the same time having much stronger effect on you than either of them individually or both of them together from a sum perspective. So, people who smoke are about 10 times more likely than the normal population to become affected with lung cancer. And people that are exposed to asbestos for a reasonable period of time are about 5 times more likely to contract an asbestos-related disease such as cancer. But there have been studies that have linked smoking and asbestos exposure in a way that creates this synergistic effect to where somebody who is a smoker who is exposed to asbestos actually has about a 50-time greater risk of contracting some form of cancer than a person in the normal population who is neither a smoker nor someone who has been exposed to asbestos fibers. So there certainly is a substantial risk associated with somebody that is involved with asbestos exposure and cigarette smoking. There's information available through EPA to help you if you have an interest in stopping smoking if you're a smoker, and certainly information associated with minimizing your risk of asbestos exposure, part of which is what we're trying to do today. So let's change gears here a little bit and get out of the conversations about asbestos disease and asbestos exposure and talk a little bit about the specific rules and regulations that have been established for dealing with asbestos. The first organization that has developed rules is an organization by the name of OSHA. That stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There is an air rule that was part of the Clean Air Act that is called NESHAP. And NESHAP stands for the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. The third rule that was promulgated that deals with asbestos is AHERA. AHERA is also known as the Asbestos in Schools Rule. It stands for the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. And we will find as we discuss this that this applies to all not-for-profit schools, kindergarten through the 12th grade. And it established specific requirements for these schools that don't apply to the other facilities and buildings that exist in the United States. And then finally, there are rules and regulations dealing with the proper transportation and disposal of asbestos through a waste management entity. The Division for Waste Management is the entity within Kentucky that regulates this, and we'll talk about what those rules are a little bit in this conversation. So let's go specifically to OSHA right now, because OSHA probably is the most confusing of these rules. But if we get to OSHA, you understand that it deals specifically with worker protection. It's involved in dealing with the protection of people that occupied premises as employees, and it deals both with their exposure in a non-construction environment. The OSHA standard that relates to this is the OSHA General Industry Standard. That applies to secretaries, it applies to teachers, it applies to truck drivers, it applies to any employee that is operating, that is working within an environment where there is asbestos materials. Once you get into a process where there are asbestos activities going on, whether these are asbestos removal or asbestos cleanups or anything that would actually disturb asbestos, there is an OSHA standard called the Construction Industry Standard that applies to the people who are actually doing the work that disturbs the asbestos. So we have, under OSHA, we have a general industry standard that deals with daily activities and people who are not involved in disturbing asbestos. When we get into disturbing asbestos, we get along into a rule that's called the OSHA Construction Industry Standard. So let's briefly discuss the general industry standard. It's the standard that is applicable, first of all, for building maintenance and custodial personnel. The general industry standard is the industry standard for asbestos that applies to maintenance personnel and custodial personnel, as long as their responsibilities do not involve specifically disturbing asbestos. The construction industry standard, as we indicated earlier, is a standard that involves for people that disturb asbestos in the workplace. So if you are a custodian and you're doing something that disturbs asbestos, then you get involved in a different type of regulation, which is the construction regulation, and the standards are much more stringent and require certain types of things that normal maintenance and custodial workers aren't going to be trained for or equipped to do, so that in general the process within schools is to avoid anything that disturbs the asbestos materials. So there is a permissible exposure limit. This is what triggers an activity under OSHA, under the general industry standard, and that is you can't have more than 1 fiber of asbestos per cubic centimeter of air. This is a standard that the units really aren't that relevant. It suffices to say that under normal circumstances there isn't any way that an environment can exceed this personal exposure level unless something is being done to disturb the asbestos. And you can determine whether or not an area exceeds this standard by certain types of exposure monitoring, testing the concentrations of asbestos in the air to determine if somebody is or isn't being exposed to that level. OSHA also has a requirement for communicating information about asbestos in the workplace to the people that are there. Certain types of requirements for labeling and signage in areas where common areas maintenance is going on. Training, such as we're doing today, so that people are aware of the issues associated with asbestos and the things that they can do to prevent the release of asbestos or making asbestos friable. And there are specific standards for housekeeping, how you are supposed to do your jobs in areas that have asbestos, and record keeping. We'll talk some about this housekeeping in a later area of our presentation. So now that we have OSHA, we're going to discuss 2 of the other air regulations that deal with asbestos. The first one is the NESHAP regulation. As I said earlier, this is the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. When the Clean Air Act was adopted in the 1970s, the people that promulgated this rule, EPA and Congress, they assigned certain types of air contaminants as hazardous. One of them was asbestos. It generally was introduced into the Clean Air Act under the NESHAP portion to prevent the release of asbestos into the air, the outside air, through smokestacks at asbestos mining and process operations. The second rule is the rule that was promulgated by Congress in 1988, which is called the AHERA regulation, which is primarily why you're here. And Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, as I had indicated earlier, is applicable to from kindergarten to 12th grade in not-for-profit schools. So let's compare these things and see where the authority for managing them actually occurs. There are typically, AHERA is regulated at the state level. Most states have what is called concurrent jurisdiction, where they've gotten the authority from EPA to regulate the AHERA regulation in their state, and Kentucky is one of the states that has this. Under this, the state regulates all components of the AHERA regulation, which involves personal certifications, specific types of inspections, various types of surveillances, types of record keeping, and response actions. Under NESHAP, depending on where you are, it may be a local or it may be a state-regulated activity. Within Jefferson County, City of Louisville, there is a local air pollution control district, the Louisville Metro Air Pollution Control District, that has the authority to regulate asbestos abatement under the NESHAP regulation. Where if you're in Franklin County or Pike County or any place outside of Jefferson County but in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the state itself not only regulates the AHERA regulation but also regulates the NESHAP. So let's talk a little bit about NESHAP in particular. It regulates contractors and work practices for asbestos removal. It regulates contractors and work practices for asbestos removal. It deals specifically with asbestos identification and removal prior to demolition or renovation activities. It does require an additional inspection as part of any planned renovation or demolition. If your school or facility is involved in one of these planned renovations, you have to understand that the AHERA inspection report that you have in your files may not be adequate, and in most times is not adequate, to comply with the requirements for inspection under NESHAP. AHERA does no destruction or demolition to identify areas where asbestos may be. For example, in some instances there will be pipe insulation that contains asbestos inside interior walls. You don't have to identify asbestos insulation in interior walls for AHERA. However, you do for NESHAP. If you're going to tear a wall out and there could be pipe insulation inside it that has asbestos, you have to know whether it's there or not before you start. So make sure that you understand that your AHERA asbestos inspection is not adequate to comply with the asbestos inspection requirements under NESHAP. NESHAP only requires asbestos removal under two circumstances. The first circumstance is if you're going to demolish the building. If you're going to tear a building down, you have to know where the asbestos is, and then you have to determine whether the asbestos is friable or non-friable, and any material that is either friable or potentially friable has to be removed before you can do demolition of the building. The same is true for renovation. If you're going to do any planned renovation where you could or would disturb asbestos material and render it friable, then you have to remove that material before you conduct the renovation. Let's say that you're going to renovate an office space, but that there is asbestos floor tile in the classroom that's adjacent to the office. Well, you could renovate the office space and not do anything to damage the floor tile, so that you really don't have to do anything with the asbestos that's in the classroom if you're going to renovate the office space. However, if you're going to take that classroom and turn it into two offices by putting a wall down the middle, then the process that you would use for that renovation could and would disturb the asbestos-containing floor tile, so that you would be required under the NESHAP rule to deal with the asbestos floor tile and at least remove the asbestos floor tile that would be in your way before you would do this renovation. NESHAP also has a number of other specific requirements. It requires a specific way for packaging and transporting asbestos-containing waste materials. It has a specific stipulation that you can't generate any visible wastes. If you're tearing down a building with asbestos, you can't have dust from asbestos going out into the environment outside. You are required under NESHAP to make a notification. You have to let the regulators know that you're going to do an asbestos activity at least 10 work days prior to beginning that activity. There are specific work practices and procedures that NESHAP requires that they have implemented in order to render the asbestos in a way that doesn't release asbestos fibers into the atmosphere. And under NESHAP, there is a requirement for proper disposal of asbestos materials according to a series of standard protocols and procedures. Bear in mind that the NESHAP regulation only certifies companies. There's not an individual certification under NESHAP. It does require this 10-day notification in advance of any type of ACM removal, and NESHAP itself has no record-keeping requirements at all. We'll see that this is one of the biggest differences between the NESHAP and the AHERA regulation. The AHERA, you have to document, and keep those records to prove that you did things the right way, while under NESHAP, there are certain things that you have to do, but there isn't any requirement to keep any records at all. Bear in mind that as under the NESHAP rule, the school as the owner is the owner of any asbestos waste from the time that it's generated for the rest of its life. The asbestos that's in your school belongs to your school right now in place, and if it's removed and taken out of the school by a different contractor, hauled to a landfill, put in the landfill, that's still your asbestos waste when it gets to the landfill. If it doesn't get to the landfill and it goes to Joe's backyard, it's still your asbestos waste as well. I tell you this because there is a manifest system that is associated with transporting asbestos waste from an owner's facility to a licensed landfill, and that manifest is something that I would recommend highly that you require, even though it isn't a component of the NESHAP regulation, so that you can prove that your asbestos waste got from your building where it was in place to a different location where the asbestos contractor has ultimately disposed of that material. We're going to talk about the AHERA regulation now, which is actually the meat of what it is that we're trying to present to you today. The federal government and Congress promulgated a rule in 1983 that required inspections of all school buildings to see if they had asbestos. It was a very haphazard rule done in a period of time when there wasn't a whole lot of knowledge about asbestos. It generated a lot of information which I think ultimately ended up being mostly garbage for most places because there were no specific guidelines associated with what you were supposed to do with the information. It didn't tell you, for example, whether you needed to sample or not sample pipe insulation. It didn't tell you whether you needed to sample or not sample floor tile. It didn't ask you to decide what kind of condition the material was in. It just asked you to go in and find out if it was there. And as a result, asbestos inspections throughout the country were done in a very large number of different ways. Some people did a detailed inspection that included pipe insulation, it included spray-on surfacing materials, it included roofing materials, it included everything that at the time was known to potentially be an asbestos-containing material. Other people went in and only sampled materials where the asbestos materials were not intact. So a school could have had thousands and thousands of feet of asbestos-containing pipe insulation, but if the jackets around all of the pipes were okay, not chipped or cracked or gouged or anything, or the floor tile was in pristine condition without being cracked into chunks, a lot of places this material was never sampled. And then you were left with the issue of what does this mean? We've got this information that we know that asbestos for school children could be a bad scenario. Exposure to it could create some potential long-term adverse health problems, but we don't have any direction under the rule about what you're supposed to do if you find it. or determine what the hazard associated with it was. So, for a number of years, the EPA worked on this and Congress worked on it, and in October of 1988, Congress, EPA came up with this AHERA regulation. The AHERA regulation is essentially a comprehensive plan for managing all of the asbestos that's in all of these school buildings, kindergarten through 12, from the time that it is identified until the time that it is removed from the school. It is a comprehensive plan that included initial inspections where you went in and you had to identify any suspect asbestos containing building material that could be present inside the school. The regulation gives you a detailed map of how you have to do an inspection, and it includes all suspect materials, friable or not. It includes pipe insulation, surfacing materials, asbestos containing or non-asbestos floor tiles, ceiling tiles. It lists all of the things that you need to inspect. Not only were you required initially to inspect these materials, but the person doing the management plan, this comprehensive plan, also had to do a physical assessment of what is the condition of the material and what is the potential for people to be exposed to this material in a way that would become hazardous. In other words, are the floor tiles crumbling? Is the pipe insulation damaged? Is the pipe insulation damaged in a crawl space where nobody goes, or is it a pipe insulation that had a riser in the back of a classroom where every other day some 6-year-old kid is poking it with a pencil, or 8th grader is carving his initials on it? So you had to identify where asbestos materials were, and you had to assess both the condition of the material and the risk for people to be exposed to the material. Based upon this, you had to develop a response action. The AHERA regulation said that the response action had to fix immediately any problem that existed in the school building at the time of the inspection and assessment. If you had flaking insulation, if you had crumbling surfacing material, if you had piles of asbestos on the floor, you had to develop a plan on the initial assessment to take care of these and render any asbestos materials that you were not going to automatically remove into a good condition state so that they didn't any longer pose a risk to the people in the building. These things that you can do are called response actions, the things like removing it or patching it or repairing it. Under the AHERA regulation, the term that they gave these was response action. One of the response action that the EPA allowed is a response action that's called operations and maintenance. If you had asbestos materials in your facility, in your schools, that is in good condition, if these materials are in good condition and you don't have the resources or the desire to remove them, then you can implement a response action that is called operations and maintenance. Operations and maintenance is basically a comprehensive plan to maintain asbestos materials in good condition, to notify anybody who may come into contact with these materials that there are materials there so that there is not any inadvertent deterioration or destruction of the materials. And this is an ongoing plan that you can keep in place until the building is ultimately demolished, which you have to assume that at some point in time most school buildings will be demolished or renovated, and at that point in time the asbestos needs to be removed. So let's talk a little bit about the inspections. The first inspection was the initial inspection, and this was conducted by most facilities, or under the law it was supposed to be performed by all schools in 1988. And this is when the original management plan was developed. There is a terminology that is associated with a periodic monitoring to make sure that the amount of asbestos that's in a building doesn't change and its condition doesn't change. Once you've got material in good condition, you have to go through every 6 months and conduct what is called a periodic surveillance. A periodic surveillance is a process, like I indicated just a moment ago, to determine that there are no changes to the quantity or the condition of asbestos materials in a building. If there are, then you have to implement strategies immediately to rectify and correct these conditions. But the periodic surveillance essentially is the process that's used every 6 months to make sure that conditions within a building do not change. There isn't any specific type of certification or training that's required for a person conducting periodic surveillances. However, the person doing this should have a knowledge of asbestos, and they need to know where all of the asbestos is in a building, and they should have some knowledge about what to do if one of these conditions change. So it's not required, but we normally recommend that somebody either have some kind of additional training or that the person doing the periodic surveillance actually is a certified asbestos inspector under the rule. Then the way the rule is written, a person who is a certified inspector and management planner under the law has to go back in and redo the management plan for the school. This is called a 3-year reinspection. In some instances, if there haven't been any changes to the asbestos in the building, this can be as simple as recording a single-page form that says there haven't been any changes, but then making copies of all of the required documentation, the notices to parents, the notices to teachers, certificates of training for maintenance and custodial staff, any type of record that you have to keep over the period of those 3 years needs to be copied, and then that needs to be sent to the Division for Air Quality in Frankfurt for Kentucky to meet the requirement for a 3-year reinspection. If in fact there has been asbestos abatement that has occurred, or a response action like encapsulation or enclosure that has occurred, then the 3-year reinspection is substantially more complex and complicated. First of all, you have to provide documentation that all of this was done in accordance with the rule. Secondly, the certified inspector and management planner has to go back into your management plan and bring it up to date. Take out the areas in your plan that were listed as asbestos containing before the abatement occurred. Modify the quantities of asbestos materials that are in your management plan to reflect the changes that occurred. And then all of this information, the abatement records and the documentation, needs to be compiled into a single format that is subsequently sent to the Division for Air Quality as the 3-year reinspection. AHERA also has a requirement for training. That's what we're doing here today, is we're completing the training requirement under AHERA. And the AHERA regulation specifically stipulates a 2-hour awareness training for all maintenance and custodial personnel who work in buildings where asbestos is present, as long as their jobs don't disturb asbestos. Then you have to document that you've received this training if you are the school administration by keeping a record that certifies that Susie Q or John Jones actually attended this class and understood what the information was that was provided. Say again that because you've attended this 2-hour asbestos awareness training under AHERA, that does not give anybody in this classroom the opportunity or the regulatory authority to remove any asbestos at all. You can't disturb, remove, clean up any asbestos because you've had this. Now, there are custodial and maintenance workers that may actually be under the guise of a program within a school system or LEA, a local education agency, that do disturb asbestos. Some school districts opt for having some of their maintenance staff or custodial staff actually acquire additional training that allows them to do work that involves removing asbestos. If you're going to do that, you have to have this training class, which is called the Asbestos Awareness Class, but then you have to have an additional 14 hours of training that's called O&M Asbestos Worker Training. And you have to take that class, which includes some more classroom training and some hands-on training. If you have both of these types of training, then you have the authority under AHERA to disturb a maximum of 3 square feet of material. You can clean up It's 3 square feet of asbestos materials. You can pick up 3 12-inch ceiling tiles that fell from the ground that have asbestos. You can pick up 3 asbestos-containing floor tiles, but you can't do any more work than what is considered to be 3 square or 3 linear feet. Under the AHERA regulation, the training needs to be provided to the custodial and the maintenance people early in their hiring process, usually within the first 30 days. You need to be trained with this information that we're providing today so that you don't do anything to unintentionally disturb asbestos, and then all of these records have to be kept for as long as you are employed at the school and 20 years thereafter. The AHERA requirement has no stipulation for retraining on an annual basis. In other words, to fulfill the requirements for training under AHERA, you only have to take this class one time and retain this information for as long as you're working in a school. OSHA, however, has a training requirement for people that are doing the same type of work that AHERA calls maintenance and custodial workers. They have a requirement for an annual refresher. The components of the 2 classes are essentially the same, but AHERA has no requirement for a periodic recertification or retaking of the class, whereas OSHA requires an annual refresher which covers exactly the same information year in and year out. We've used the term response action as we talk through this AHERA regulation. I've used terminology like removal, I've used terminology like operations and maintenance or O&M. There are a number of specific requirements or specific types of response action which AHERA defines. These include dealing with asbestos that's in a friable state, and that would be repair, it would be enclosure, it would be encapsulation, or it would be removal. Repair would be something as simple as taking a pipe that is a jacket of an insulation on a pipe, and if it has a gouge or a chunk out of it, putting something around it to fix it. Enclosure or encapsulation means actually building some sort of a physical barrier around or on top of the asbestos material to prevent it from being accessible and or friable. And then removal is essentially what removal means. Actually taking the material out, removing it from the building, and taking it to an approved landfill to where it no longer is a component of the building materials any longer. All of these are options for friable asbestos and can be used for non-friable asbestos at the discretion of the school district, the LEA designee, or the local education association, and they have the option of doing this both for friable and non-friable materials. Asbestos that is in good condition, as we've spent some time talking about, can undergo this response action called the O&M plan. And it can be managed under the O&M plan with no requirement for removal, with the exception of the knee shafts and all of these things that we've discussed. But as long as it's in place and isn't going to be disturbed, it can be managed under this operations and maintenance program from the day that the O&M program is implemented until the time that it is removed. The next area that we're going to discuss is locating asbestos-containing materials within a school building. And we're going to address this from a couple of different perspectives. Most specifically, we're going to talk in general terms of where different types of asbestos materials commonly occur within a school building, and then we're going to give you some direction on how to specifically identify the types and locations of materials that occur in your building. The EPA, when they promulgated the AHERA regulation, they broke the types of materials that could be in a school building down into 3 categories. One is called thermal system insulation, and thermal system insulation is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's insulation that goes over something that's hot or cold to keep the hot or cold inside. So normally when you're dealing with thermal system insulation, you would be looking at things like pipe insulation. insulation that runs on hot and cold water lines, it runs on steam lines. As a subset of that would be the elbows and the fittings and the T's, where some of these materials have a different kind of material than is on the pipe. We talked about this blue mud earlier, and blue mud is a form of fitting insulation. A lot of times you will find the pipe hangers, when pipe actually hangs from the surface above, and there is this hanger that it sort of sits in like a saddle. It's not uncommon in some instances for there to be a hard material underneath that hanger, even if the insulation around the pipe is not asbestos, and that hard material a lot of time is asbestos containing material. So you have thermal system insulation that falls into these categories. And it's not always easy to tell by inspection whether a material most likely is or isn't asbestos. The two things that I can tell you that are not asbestos is that if you have foam insulation on an air conditioning line, the foam insulation is never asbestos. The second thing is that if you have insulation that looks like fiberglass, feels like fiberglass, and crunches like fiberglass, that insulation is not asbestos. However, there are instances that we have found where the fabrication, the mastic that is put on the outside of a fiberglass run of pipe insulation actually has asbestos in it. So there's not any real way to tell. There is a rule of thumb that I like to give out in this, is that if you go up and you touch some insulation and the insulation is hard to your touch, then you should assume that it's asbestos. Check your asbestos management plan. If your asbestos management plan doesn't specifically address the material, have it tested before you do anything to disturb this material. The next type of material that I'm going to talk about is a designation that's called surfacing material. The surfacing material is the material that we discussed back when we were talking about fireproofing and decorative material. It is always troweled on or spray applied, and some of these textured materials do have a tendency to have asbestos in them. A lot of times they're soft and pliable. Sometimes you actually can stick your finger up through them. A lot of times kids will literally carve their initials into the hallways, or say Joe loves Mary and put a heart, put that into the surfacing material. But a lot of times they're not necessarily soft and pliable. A lot of times the spackled material that you see as the finish on drywall in a flower head or a flower type material, this is a decorative finish, and a lot of times this material actually has asbestos on it as well. So with surfacing materials, in order to determine whether or not you have an asbestos material there, you always have to sample. Let's talk about the other category that's called miscellaneous materials, because the miscellaneous materials, by definition, are anything that aren't surfacing materials or thermal system insulation. So what would that include? It's a myriad of things. Let's talk about floor tiles. Floor tiles would be a miscellaneous material, and floor tiles could contain asbestos. Normally you'll find floor tiles in two different sizes depending on the era when they were installed. There's typically a 9-inch floor tile, which is the older type of floor tile that was installed, and then the more recent floor tiles are 12 inches. You can't use this as a determining factor as to whether or not the material is asbestos. There are asbestos materials in both the 12-inch and the 9-inch floor tiles. A 9-inch floor tile has about a 90% chance of containing asbestos. The 12-inch floor tile, in the year 2010 probably has about a 5 to 10% chance of containing asbestos, just because most floor tiles these days don't contain asbestos. I will point out that it is significant that over the course of the last year or so, we have found an influx of asbestos-containing materials being imported into the United States, particularly in mastics and roofing materials and in floor tiles from other countries. And I would heartily suggest that if you go through the process of doing an asbestos abatement activity, and you're going to come back with another material that you believe to be non-asbestos, or if you're doing a major renovation, that you would at least stipulate that the materials not contain asbestos. We've actually found some boxes coming in from foreign countries that when you look at the box, it said, caution, this material contains asbestos. So even though it is against the rules of the EPA to use asbestos in building materials these days, some of these are coming back into the country. So getting back to the point of discussion, floor tiles may have asbestos in them, so may the glues, which are called mastics, that actually hold these floor tiles to the substrate below. There's not any way to tell without actually testing both the floor tile and the glue whether these materials have asbestos, but they are found to be present in these materials in a lot of different buildings. Another place where you might find it is in transite panels. Sometimes you'll have cement panels that are actually part of, let's say, boiler rooms. We've seen them found as separators between toilets and urinals in bathrooms. We found them a lot of times as shingles on the outside of buildings, which these are technically not part of AHERA, but they're also areas where you could have asbestos. A lot of times this cementitious material has anywhere from 10 to 30% asbestos in it. We talked a little bit before, and I'm going to reiterate again, that ceiling tiles can have asbestos in it, both the lay-in ceiling tiles, the 2x2 ceiling tiles, 2x4 lay-in ceiling tiles. There are instances where there are asbestos materials in these ceiling tiles. The 12-inch acoustic tiles also can contain asbestos. More frequently than not, these materials don't contain asbestos, but the glue dots that actually hold the ceiling tiles to the plaster or to the drywall above can contain asbestos, and more frequently it is found here than in the ceiling tiles. Another area where it's very common to have asbestos that most people don't think about is in sheet vinyl flooring. If you look actually closely at the composition of sheet vinyl, linoleum flooring, you'll see a vinyl surface that's on the top, but underneath there is a pad. It's like an absorbent pad to cushion it when people walk on it. And it's not uncommon in certain eras of this sheet vinyl products for the pad below the vinyl to contain asbestos. The linoleum itself, the sheet vinyl itself, will not contain asbestos, but the pad below frequently is a very friable form of asbestos, and it can be anywhere from 10 to 70% asbestos. So if you have linoleum, you need to check the vinyl backing on it to make sure that that vinyl backing isn't asbestos before you go doing anything to disturb it. So these are some general guidelines, and in a generic presentation like this, it's impossible for me to tell you specific locations where you will find asbestos in your school, but there are people who can help you with that. Every school system has an LEA designee. We talked about that LEA designee, and part of this training should be someone at the school telling you who that designated person is. In addition to that, every school should have an asbestos management plan that was developed under AHERA in 1988. It's kept up to date with the 6 months inspections, the 6-month periodic surveillances, and the 3-year re-inspections. In order to find out where you have asbestos in your school, you need to consult with your LEA designee, and you need to find the copy of your asbestos management plan, take a look at that, and then get some assistance from somebody who actually can help you understand how to read the management plan and understand the specific locations and types of asbestos in your school. In the meantime, and in between time, whenever you're in doubt about a material that could contain asbestos, always assume that it is. If the material is suspect material, assume that it is, and then find out by contacting somebody before you make the mistake of disturbing it. It's always better to be safe than to be sorry. So with all of this information, the other thing that you have to know is, how do you recognize damaged asbestos materials? You might ask why that's important. Well, let's go back to the original concept that we discussed with this word that we've used over and over and over again, friable. Damaged asbestos material is an asbestos material that, because of its condition, is in a state where it can become friable. And so we want to help you get some guidance with respect to how do you make an assessment of a damaged material, because a damaged material is a friable material. I'll reiterate that if you have asbestos materials in good condition, They don't pose a health risk. The goal of O&M is to keep everything in good condition, but there are instances that will happen when asbestos in good condition may change its state instantaneously. Let's take, for example, you have asbestos on a hot water line, and someplace overnight the hot water line gets a leak in it. The leak saturates the insulation. You come into the maintenance room the next morning, you have pipe insulation laying on the ground and water running all over the place. Well, obviously the condition of the asbestos insulation has changed since then. It's gone from being intact and non-damaged to damaged and friable overnight because of the water. So what are the things or indicators of damaged material? Well, first of all, if you have some material that is wet or water stained, that's an indicator that you might have something going on that creates a damaged situation. If you have rips or chunks or gouges, if pipe insulation or floor tiles or in pieces are gouged out, that's an indication that you have some damaged material. The other indication is sort of self-explanatory, but one of the things that EPA lists is how you know if damaged material may be damaged, and that is if you've got loose debris on the floor or other surfaces and that debris contains asbestos, then you know it's damaged. So those are the main indicators. If you have something that's wet or water stained, if you have it broken into pieces, or if you have chunks or gouges in it, or if there are piles of it laying around, then you should be able to recognize that as a potentially damaged asbestos material. So what does that mean? There are some categories that go with handling asbestos that becomes dislodged. And these are episodes similar to what I'm representing in the earlier part of this conversation about damaged asbestos, because if you have something that happens with an episodic event, water happens, or the ceiling falls, or ceiling tiles fall out, this is an episodic event, and there are two different categories of episodic events that the AHERA law addresses. The first one is called a minor fiber release episode. A minor fiber release episode is an episode where less than 3 square feet or 3 linear feet of material is disturbed. If you have that, then there are certain actions that need to be taken under the rule for isolating the work area and taking care of what it is that you need to do in an area where you've had a minor fiber release episode. Recall that you do not have the certification or the training as a custodian or a maintenance person from this training to respond to that situation, but you need to know when it exists so that you can inform the LEA designee or somebody else in authority when you have that condition. The other one is called a major fiber release episode, and guess what? That's an episode where you've had an episodic event that disturbs more than 3 square feet of asbestos material. In neither event are you to do anything involved with rectifying the condition or fixing the situation, but in every event, if you are the person who discovers it, you actually are the person who should notify an LEA designee who has had additional training that knows how the appropriate response for these materials are. Remember, in every instance, it's not what you see, but what you can't see that can hurt you. If the asbestos is laying on the ground, it's not creating any problems. Even if you've had a fiber release episode, it isn't the asbestos on the ground that is the risk. It's the very small fibers that are in the air that are too small to see and small enough to get into your lungs, so be aware of that. The final category that I want to talk about within the framework of rules and regulations is housekeeping. There are certain procedures that are stipulated by OSHA and AHERA as it relates to housekeeping, and certain things that you have to manage in order to be able to be sure that you don't do anything to create a friable situation. Let's talk about a floor material that has asbestos floor tile. First of all, neither OSHA nor AHERA will allow you to sand or grind that floor. You can't use sanding of any type in maintaining an asbestos-containing floor. There are certain procedures that you have to follow if you're going to strip off the wax or the finishes on an asbestos-containing floor. Number one, you have to use low abrasion pads. You can't use high abrasion pads that will actually penetrate into and beyond the surface of the asbestos-containing floor tile. And third, if you're using a buffer to strip, you have to use a low-speed buffer that actually oscillates at a rate of less than 300 RPM. These are required by both AHERA and OSHA, so if you're going to do stripping with a buffer or a mechanical device on an asbestos-containing floor tile, you have to be sure that the pads are non-abrasive and that they are operating at a rate less than 300 RPM. You have to strip the floors using wet methods. You have to make sure there's plenty of water present so that in the event that any fibers might incidentally be generated by what you're doing, there is enough water on there to prevent the dispersion of these fibers into the environment. There are rules that deal with dry buffing, and you have to have sufficient finish on the floor that you are going to dry buff, enough wax buildup, sealer and wax on the floor tile so that the buffing does not actually contact the asbestos. Normally, floor tile is constructed with a layer on the top of the floor tile that is non-asbestos. Typically in floor tile, the asbestos fibers are embedded within the internal layers of the floor tile. And if you don't do anything to disrupt the top layer of the tile, you're not going to do anything to expose the asbestos fibers that are on the internal portion of that floor tile. So if you're going to do dry buffing, you need to be sure that you actually have enough material on the top of the floor tile to prevent you from penetrating into that bottom layer. Generally, the asbestos management policy for your school is if you are a custodian or a maintenance person and the only training that you're getting are these 2 hours of training that you're receiving at the moment, you are not to touch any asbestos materials at all in your school. You should never sweep, clean up, or pick up any suspect material that has asbestos debris in it. If you find these conditions existing in an environment, your task is simply to, as soon as you can, notify a person in authority. Notify the facility manager, notify the principal, notify the LEA designee, notify somebody who can make a decision about getting the right people in place to come in and respond to the situation. If you have to do a job and you suspect that there is asbestos in the way of the job that you're going to do, don't do the job until you talk to your supervisor or the LEA designee. Find out if the task that you're doing is going to disturb asbestos. If it is, you can't do it. Somebody else has to do that work. But notify the person before you start the work, not after you start the work. If you see suspect asbestos debris on the floor, if it's a result of a minor fiber release episode, a major fiber release episode, or just something where you see dust that you think for some reason might have asbestos in it, don't clean it up. You don't have the certification or the credentials to clean it up, and for you to do that would be a violation of the asbestos laws that apply to your school. Notify the designated person. Tell somebody in authority that has the knowledge and the training necessary to get the work done correctly.